I'm Katie. I started in the full-service sex industry
My name is
at a
Ellis Andrews.
brothel.
I am the Executive
My name
Program
is
Director for
Wotton.
SWAT Behind Bars.
I've been a sex worker
I'm
for
Abby
over
Temple.
30 years.
I've been really interested in like the different experiences that a lot of like different people have
That
working
there is a
around the
level of
world. So that's
protection.
kind of where
So I
this
think the
project came into being.
I think that our most underutilized advocacy skill is the listening one. I think that when we fail to listen, we fail to fully understand the scope of the problem. And so I think that a lot of times those of us who are in activism or advocacy need to just shut the fuck up and listen to what other people have to say, regardless of whether it's somebody with completely opposing viewpoints or if it's someone with a little sticky point, like a sticky computer key.
Hello, and welcome to Illuminated in Red Light, the podcast that dispels some of the myths and misconceptions around the sex industry through discussions with real sex workers from around the world. My name is Emma, and I will be the hopefully not too annoying voice in your ear in between conversations with some of the most interesting people you will ever meet. Sex work is one of the world's oldest occupations, and it's also one of the most beautiful and diverse industries in the world. And yet at the same time, it is one of the most misunderstood. In fact, I would bet that some people have already turned off this podcast at the mere mention of the industry. A couple of years ago, I might have as well. I used to buy into the idea that sex work happened on those dark street corners of Hollywood films, where scantily clad bodies and drugs and alcohol, crime, and even death were prolific. Sinful depictions that were illuminated in red light for the underbelly of the world. That image of the industry is probably not very different to what a large portion of the population thinks as well. I theorize that this is because a lot of people, and a couple of years ago myself included, have never stopped to listen to the people who actually buy and sell sex. I passed a judgment based on what the media and centuries of misinformation had taught me. And honestly, I wasn't necessarily to blame, and neither would you be. There's a reason that these stereotypes are so prolific. This podcast aims to shed light on the stories and voices of real people from the sex industry from around the world, in an effort to rewrite some of the false narratives that have overshadowed the red light industry for centuries. On the last episode of Illuminated in Red Light, we looked into what living in different models of legislation around sex work looks like for different people around the world. This episode, as promised, is going to take a deeper dive into the false narratives that have been generated as a result of these legislations, or which have shockingly been created as part of the fabricated and biased reporting on the industry. Along with the infamous sex trafficking narrative, which has become prolific in the media and governments across the globe, we will also be talking about the bizarre narrative around the benefits of police raids when it comes to quote-unquote sex trafficking rings. Sex trafficking. God, it's a scary idea, and the words conjure up some scary images. My first introduction to sex trafficking was when I watched Taken on a plane when I was 16. After that, I was inundated with stories about door handles being poisoned by lurking criminals, or red tickets being attached to car windshields, which was meant to alert traffickers to the presence of an unattended woman. Maybe this is the experience of some of the listeners on this podcast, too. I actually met some people while traveling in the United States who were scared to get into an Uber in Miami because they were, and I quote, definitely going to get kidnapped and sold to some sex ring. Absolutely nothing I could tell them would assuage them of these beliefs. And these were college-educated people, one of whom was applying to med schools, that had been so conditioned by media reporting and content that they were convinced that somebody was constantly lurking around a corner to snatch them up in the same manner of Liam Neeson's daughter in the film. If I'm being completely honest, the topic of today's podcast is one that I am always ready and hot-headed to talk about. However, I figured that this might be for a completely different project, considering the harm that can happen when you conflate these two very distinct topics. However, when I started talking and interviewing and reading through all of my research, I realized that the topic of sex trafficking has become so unfortunately intertwined with sex work that it is well worth it to have a discussion about how we as a society got here and what the perspective of actual sex workers and academics on this piece of stigma is. However, before I begin, I would like to make a few things very clear. Sex trafficking and sex work are not the same thing. Not at all. The simplest way to define them is that one is consensual and one isn't. The constant conflation of the two is due to a few key factors. Sex workers are routinely infantilized and accused of not being able to consent to their work, and also that sex trafficking is frequently enabled by the criminalization of the sex industry. To simplify this entire episode, decriminalizing sex work enables the free-flowing communication of sex workers and or clients with authority if they happened upon an instance of sex trafficking. It prevents the abuse of power through blackmail or citizenship status, which can be the backbone of many sex trafficking cases, and it stops broad definitions of sex trafficking from improperly inflating the statistics of trafficking. The decriminalization of sex work is the best way to prevent sex trafficking. Full stop. I also wanted to emphasize that if this topic is one that interests you, please read through the documents and book that I have linked in the show notes, and I also encourage you to do your own research by reading or otherwise consuming the stories of real people who have been in the sex industry and real people who have been sex trafficked. I am in no way a voice of authority on this topic. I'm just a college student who is trying her very best to get the correct information to as many people as possible. Sex trafficking, much like murder, is most often committed by somebody that the victim is close to. For instance, their father, their partner, or a trusted friend or family member. While writing this episode, I googled sex trafficking statistics, and I was bombarded with a huge plethora of quote-unquote anti-trafficking agencies. One agency, called Our Rescue, wrote that there were 49.6 million people who were being human trafficked around the world. Firstly, Our Rescue is claiming that this number is for the total number of human trafficking, and the distinction here is important because human trafficking in general is different to sex trafficking. Human trafficking most commonly refers to labor trafficking, as in people who are brought across borders to work without pay or with little pay, or simply without proper licensing. Already, I was surprised that Google had taken me straight to a number for human trafficking victims, not sex trafficking as I had queried. In fact, no matter how I phrased the question, sex trafficking statistics, Google simply could not produce a number of actual sex trafficking victims in the world, differentiated from the number of human trafficking victims. I wanted to use this as an example as to why sex trafficking is often correlated with these impossibly large numbers and generates a lot of hysteria amongst the government and the general population. However, these numbers are not actually accurate to what the real world situation is. Secondly, I investigated the sources that Our Rescue had linked their numbers to. One of the sources that they quoted from was from ILO, or the International Labor Organization. ILO wrote on page 14 of their paper, The Economics of Forced Labor, that they believed that there was to be a purported 6.3 million people in forced sexual labor situations globally. This was still an obscene amount of people who are apparently being sexually trafficked, and yet a distinctly lower number than the 46.9 million people that pops up when you Google sex trafficking numbers. Furthermore, ILO didn't state in that specific paragraph where they had pulled that number from. So I kept reading, and I found another passage on the estimation methods of determining revenue from sex trafficking, which claimed, along with Our Rescue, that $173 billion was being generated from sex trafficking. The passage read, quote, "Data on the annual revenues generated in forced commercial and sexual exploitation is extremely scarce because of the illicit nature of the activity. As with the ILO 2014 report, the estimates of illegal profits from coerced sexual exploitation are based on Global Sex Trafficking Metric database from 2016, which remains virtually the only source of comparable data from multiple countries on the economics of forced commercial sexual exploitation and revenues from it. The 2021 global estimates of forced labor are the sources for the data on the number of people in forced commercial sexual exploitation." Okay, fair enough. Data is hard to come by when it's from an underground operation. So I went ahead and followed the footnote that they had linked to the Global Sex Trafficking Metrics database for 2016, which I would like to state again was used for the 2021 paper that I was reading from, and I found that their source information was from the book Modern Slavery, A Global Perspective by Siddharth Kara. I looked into this book and I found that Siddharth Kara, while traveling 41 countries over 15 years, had identified 900 cases of sex trafficking, according to the Columbia Press. Are you confused? Because I am certainly confused. How did we go from Googling sex trafficking with 46.9 million cases to an uncited 6.3 million to 900 cases worldwide? Now look, I'm not an expert researcher. I absolutely could have misread this. So I decided to rest my amateur detective skills and look to the experts. Lisa Fedina published a paper entitled The Use and Misuse of Research in Books on Sex Trafficking, Implications for Interdisciplinary Researchers, Practitioners, and Advocates. She writes, quote, "For example, a review of current literature on human trafficking identified more than 700 research-based articles, reports, and books on human trafficking that have been published. Over half of them, 54%, contain non-empirical data, and only 12% of the literature was found to be peer-reviewed. Yet, much of the disputed research continues to appear in media and literature on the scope of human trafficking in the United States and abroad." That doesn't sound promising. The paper identified the top 3 uses of statistics in 46 books on sex trafficking specifically. The first, data from the U.S. State Department, has never actually been investigated. The department released numbers that are so often quoted as accurate, but has never explicitly stated how they came to their statistics, or the methodology behind their calculations. In short, there is no proof behind the numbers that were released. The second most used source was Disposable People, New Slavery and Global Economy by Kevin Bales. He wrote that he personally estimated that there were 27 million people who were enslaved globally, but then he later admitted to generating that number through a rough and flawed estimate, and according to Fedina, never went on to state the data or methodology he used to come up with that estimate.
The final source, Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children in the U.S., Canada, and Mexico by Estes and Neil Allen Weiner from 2001, is a commonly misquoted paper. The researchers claimed that 326,000 youth were, quote, at risk for commercial sexual exploitation, and yet they are frequently quoted as though that number were the actual and accurate number of people being sex trafficked, not a potential one. At no point in the paper did Estes and Neil claim that 326,000 was a current accurate number of people being sex trafficked.
Now, I've bombarded you with all of this information because I want to point out how complicated and misinformed the data around sex trafficking is. If we don't understand a problem, then there is no way to accurately fix it. What we end up with is a lot of panicked people making assumptions about an inflated issue for personal gain. The result is a plethora of anti-trafficking agencies like Our Rescue and Polaris, who spread misinformation. I will note that the AI-generated response from Google states that Our Rescue supports decriminalization of sex work, but going through their website I found only one mention of reducing criminalization being beneficial for survivors of sex trafficking, and another article that then listed that sex work was one of the major industries that fosters trafficking. While they didn't state whether that was because criminalization of sex work increases sex trafficking, or whether the existence of sex work in general causes sex trafficking, a completely false narrative, the ambiguity that is presented is as damaging as not saying anything about it at all. It enables people to read what they want to read and use it as proof for a cause. I could be accused of doing that very thing if they are in fact pro-decriminalization. However, they do utilize a lot of statistics from Polaris. Polaris is one of the most famous, or in my opinion, infamous anti-trafficking nonprofits in the world. They've also made a very strong stance on being anti-decriminalization, for instance in a letter written in opposition to a decriminalization bill in Washington, D.C., which I will be revisiting later in this episode. Okay, let's pause on listening to my own voice for a while and let my blood pressure go down. Instead, I'm going to let somebody who is massively more qualified than myself discuss their experience with anti-trafficking agencies.
My name is Alex Andrews. I am the Executive Program Director for SWAP Behind Bars. It stands for Sex Worker Outreach Project Behind Bars. We originally started out as a chapter of SWAP USA. I founded the organization, and we've just worked to provide, we thought we started out by sending 150 letters to incarcerated folks, thinking this will be a fun little project and it'll just be, we can exchange some letters, everybody will feel good and it'll be all done. And then 2 weeks later, it was like a fucking bomb went off in our mailbox. People were writing in, they were telling their friends within 2 weeks, we were buried. Absolutely buried. We'd never really experienced anything that was so immediately touching. You know what I mean? I've been doing work inside of prisons and jails for God, almost 20 years now, and I really, really love it. But I'd never done anything that had the same kind of impact. So it was very powerful. We've grown since then, sometimes too big, but too much administration, all that kind of thing. But at the core, we remain the same, which is an effort to create community from between that inside and outside place. We don't care if you're a sex worker, if you're a trafficking survivor, if you're a mom, if you're an aunt, if you're a purple Martian person, it doesn't make any difference.
I've been part of SWAP's pen pal program for several years now, and as a result, I've been connected to several incredible women who have been incarcerated in the United States, either because of sex work or have been previously part of the industry. I've always been hugely impressed with SWAP's work and Alex's dedication to her causes. I hesitate to call her an advocate, however, because in her own words,
I don't consider myself an advocate for either anti-trafficking or for sex worker rights. I consider myself a person who, a woman with lived experience in the sex trade who wants to encourage other people to step forward and realize that we're all the same. We're just exactly like everyone else in the world. We have plants and pets and things we care about. We're daughters, sisters, mothers, lovers, wives, governesses, lawyers. I mean, we have all kinds of different identities, but people want to stick this one scarlet letter on us. Excuse me. I gotta quit smoking. That's just all there is to it. As I light up another one. That is, I think that we need more communication between all of us. We need to accept that each other comes from a different space and time with different lived experience in and out of the sex trade, and respect those experiences. I don't ever try to tell someone that they're a survivor or that actually, oh no, I'm sorry, actually you're a sex worker. I mean, I don't do that. You can be whoever you want. And you can change tomorrow. I have no problem with it.
Alex has a good reason to dislike being told who she is. She discussed her experience of being a poster child for an anti-trafficking agency with me.
I had worked within the anti-trafficking because after I got married and all that kind of thing, I kind of left the industry for a while. And then I kind of thought, well, it'd be nice to do something and give back. So I started doing jail classes. And I kind of hooked up with an anti-trafficking organization, and they wanted me to be their poster child survivor. They wanted me to be their poster child victim, because I was obviously somebody who had managed to be involved in the sex industry as an escort, as a phone sex person, as a stripper, as a cocktail, all that. I've done it all. So I thought that they thought that, that I would make a really good poster child for that. Well, I wasn't a very cooperative poster child, and so they had some issues with that. And I've been fighting with the anti-trafficking movement ever since. I stumbled across some sex workers on Twitter. They educated me in not such a nice way. And Bella was one of them. Bella was one of the very first sex worker rights people that I ever spoke with. And she yelled at me for a long time. And then when I expressed a sincere desire to learn and understand better, she goes, you weren't a trafficking survivor, you were a sex worker. I was like, that sounds so much better to me, because it was so much more empowering than what they had given me before. And even in the early days of the anti-trafficking work, I can remember being aggravated by that term victim. I was like, 15 minutes after you get in my presence, you are no longer a victim. You are a survivor. Then we'll see what you do with it from there, because I want you to become a thriver, an overcomer. You know what I mean? For me, it's not about whether or not you're a sex worker or a survivor. It's, did you overcome your shit, and are you going to thrive now? That's what matters to me. And now I'm back to being a sex worker.
Why do you think that the anti-trafficking organization that you're working with, why do you think they were so hell-bent on having somebody to be the poster victim?
Well, because they don't have anyone who speaks out. And back then, especially in the early 2000s, they weren't talking about it. It wasn't the most, the hottest button issue of the time. They were still deciding whether or not, they had painted this picture of somebody getting snatched out of their driveway while they had just left a healthy, balanced breakfast with two-parent household. They're on their way to Catholic school where they are earning straight A's, and they get snatched out of the driveway, taken to a basement, chained to a radiator, and gagged with duct tape. Well, it doesn't work like that. I mean, it just doesn't. But that's the picture that they had. And so their vision of me was, they saw what I had become after being chained to a radiator in a basement, when I had actually been running around, being a happy hooker.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I was criminalized for that it wasn't so fun anymore.
Yeah, that's definitely, and that's still the rhetoric, like, for all of these anti-trafficking.
Well, and now it's about money. It used to be about the morality and all that kind of thing, but now it's all about money. The anti-trafficking lobby doesn't want to listen to us. They don't want to participate with us. They don't want to share our programming, because they're fucking wrong, and they're going to lose all of their funding if they go back to their Christian groups and says, you know what, the ladies are right. We need to do decrim. That seems to work really well in New Zealand, for example.
Here, Alex is referring to the use of the Prostitution Reform Act of 2003, commonly referred to as the PRA, which was enforced by my home country of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Like I mentioned in the last episode, the PRA decriminalized sex work for New Zealand residents, and has since been praised for its benefits of reducing sex trafficking and crime against sex workers. The basic reasoning is that when sex work is decriminalized, there is less chance of exploitation under the threat of being turned in for practicing an illegal act, and people who are being trafficked by someone that they know are able to report a crime without fear of being prosecuted for prostitution instead. It also allows sex workers and clients to come forward about instances of trafficking that they have witnessed without fear of indicting themselves in a crime. Bella Robinson, CEO of Cool Off Your Old Tired Ethics, or COYOTE, Rhode Island, simplifies the benefits of decriminalization.
A man goes to a hotel expecting to see a 35-year-old woman. When he opens the door, there's a 13-year-old there. He immediately knows she's a child, and he's a witness of her trafficking. But your bill doesn't want to report it, because Melissa didn't know how to explain it when they said, we can't let clients, buy sex and get away with it. So you'd rather let a serial killer or child predator go free over a misdemeanor. That's what you're saying.
Annie, who is a sex worker, author, and podcaster who lives in Canada, where sex work is regulated under the Swedish model, echoed the sentiment when I spoke to her.
But then on the other level is that if they come across someone who is being exploited, they can't report it because they're committing a crime. They'd basically be, turning themselves in. Like, it's just, it's so backwards. It just bugs me so much.
In Aotearoa, as with other decriminalized countries, this is theoretically prevented because clients would have the ability to call in trafficking without fear of arrest. A common statistic that you might have heard is that in the 5 years after PRA, there were 0 cases of sex trafficking reported in Aotearoa.
In a report from 2006 entitled People Trafficking, an International Crisis Fought at a Local Level, written by Susan Coppage, this claim was investigated. Quote, "It is true that there have been no cases of people trafficking prosecuted in New Zealand. That is, no cases involving trafficking across an international border. There have also been no cases brought under the PRA for inducing or compelling a person to provide commercial sexual services. The lack of prosecutions does not mean, however, that there is no such criminal activity in New Zealand. There have been cases brought under the PRA for assisting a person under 18 years in providing commercial sexual service, contracting for such services, and receiving earnings from such services." What Coppage is saying here is that while decriminalization has helped to stop the abuse of sex workers and traffickers, the claim of zero trafficking is in part inflated because Aotearoa has different definitions on trafficking than countries like the United States. Specifically, Aotearoa has the definition that trafficking has to involve the process of physically moving someone across a border. And I won't lie, when I read this I did chuckle a little bit because, for those who don't know, Aotearoa is one of the more isolated places in the world, just 2 islands in the middle of the Pacific, and it would take an awful lot of effort to get someone over there in order to have it count as trafficking. However, as Coppage does mention, there had been 2 smuggling cases where somebody was brought into the country since the introduction of the bill and the publication of the paper. Something else that she mentions is that there have been cases brought under PRA for assisting a person of under 18 years in providing commercial sexual service. Now, this is another important distinction that I want to make. There is a difference between sex trafficking and sex trafficking of a minor. For most cases, sex trafficking of a minor is somewhat redundant. A child cannot consent to sex, and so child sex trafficking is essentially the rape of a child, which is a completely different and horrifying issue than sex trafficking in the terms that we will be considering it in the rest of this podcast. If you would like to learn more about some of the issues around child sex trafficking, especially in how it correlates to the misconception about sex workers, I would encourage you to go and do some of your own research on some of the books or papers that I have linked in the show notes. I am not in a position where I want to comment that much on the quote-unquote child sex trafficking problem, as it becomes incredibly complicated. However, I will say that in the United States, selling sex as a child is criminalized, which in some cases has led to the very confusing and probably incredibly traumatizing result of a child being accused of trafficking themselves and facing criminal charges as a result. All in all, if you're thinking that there is somebody who is a victim, it's not a good idea to make the thing that they are allegedly being a victim of illegal, because this just puts more harm, more strain, and more power into the hands of abusers who want to use that information as a way to control their subjects.
Well, law enforcement is supposed to take care of all of us. They're supposed to serve and protect everyone. But when a worker goes in to report violence against her, she's not believed. And part of it's because she's a woman, and part of it's because she's a worker.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the problems with reporting, we saw problems with reporting with the Joey the Player case. I don't know how familiar you are with that case, but if you search hashtag Joey the Player, lots of shit will come up. You can Google it or whatever else, but this was a notorious predator that preyed on escorts and would get them to cross state lines, and then he would hold them hostage and beat them and rape them and all these kinds of things. And they were too afraid to report, because when they did go to report violence, they weren't believed, and worse yet, they were threatened with arrest for prostitution. So he went on for over a decade of being able to just do whatever he wanted whenever he wanted, and thought that he would not be caught. And it was sex workers who brought him to justice.
Katie, my friend and sex worker living in Aotearoa, discusses her own research and lived experience with sex trafficking in Aotearoa.
Beautiful. Next question, kind of same deal as the first one. I think you might have answered it, but what do you, as a currently practicing sex worker, think about the current legal policies concerning sex work in Aotearoa?
Yeah, I think they're outdated. I think the I wrote a paper about it. The prostitution law reform, again, that term in itself is not encompassing of everybody. There is so many roles within the adult industry that are not protected by that law, and therefore not also protected by other laws. There's just this weird in between. And I think that whole belief system of like, oh, we're so worried about sex trafficking is ignorant and outdated. And in fact, it causes more harm than protection. And we know that. We've been telling people that for so long, that actually your law against having migrant sex workers here mean that the people that do come and do work as sex workers get treated like asshole. They get treated like shit. They're exploited, not because they're sex trafficked. They can't, most of our migrants, particularly our Asian sex workers or our like Eastern European sex workers, come here to earn money as sex workers. They know what they're doing. They're here for a reason. But once they're here, they get exploited under the fear of being raided or outed. It's so much more harmful than the negative 1% of people who might be sex trafficked. The sex trafficking here happens internally by exploitation of relationships or fears of gang reprisal and things like that. If that happens, it's happening here already. It's not the migrant community. They're being punished for things that are happening inside this country, which is, I don't know, it's so wrong. And I don't know or foresee a change in that happening anytime soon. I think because of the massive widespread ignorance and like, we are the experts. We're telling you what's happening, but they're not interested in hearing from us. So nothing's going to change, which is devastating because I see the harms all the time. It's awful. But yeah, it's I think particularly the migrant laws.
The migrant laws that Katie mentions here is the practice of criminalizing sex work for non-Kiwi citizens. The idea is that this would theoretically discourage people from coming to Aotearoa just to practice sex work, and might encourage the trafficking of unwilling participants into the country. Personally, I find this belief to be hypocritical of the New Zealand government, since they had already proven the benefits of decriminalization among their community. What exactly is the point of abandoning those strides forward when it comes to migrant sex workers? The concept of migrant sex workers is also very well documented within anti-trafficking legislation. Most countries, including the United States and the Netherlands, consider migrant sex workers to be trafficking victims. This is due predominantly to the belief that sex work is such a victimizing industry that no one would willingly move in order to work as a sex worker, and also because of the perceived influx of sex workers from other countries that might flock to their borders and tarnish their reputations and the decency of their homes. Dr. Wotton, from New South Wales, Australia, currently based in Sydney, has been a travelling sex worker for decades.
My name's Rachel Wotton. I've been a sex worker for over 30 years. I often say that I'm a migrant sex worker because I've worked in different parts of Australia, in different parts of the industry. I've worked overseas in different places. I have always chosen to work in different countries. I've also had clients who have paid for me to visit them in different countries and interstate from where I am. I've worked in sexual massage parlors, full service establishments, often called brothels. I've done a little bit of stripping, small amounts of BDSM, lots of escorting. I have worked for madams. I have worked for different owners. I've worked in collectives. I work independently as my own self, as a sex worker. I work from home as well now, and one of the great things with decriminalization is that I can put money into my own business and into my own workplace. So as far as I know, I'm the only sex worker that has an electric ceiling hoist in my workspace, which allows for some of my clients who use wheelchairs for their mobility to be able to be transferred safely and securely from their wheelchair to the bed and back again when their support workers bring them to me.
Fantastic. That is so cool.
Do you want me to say all the other stuff? So I'm also an academic. I've also done advocacy for 30 years. I've previously held paid and volunteer roles in SWAP New South Wales, in Scarlet Alliance, the Australian Sex Worker Association. I was a co-founder for Touching Base, an organisation based in Sydney, New South Wales, Australia. that brings together sex workers and people with disability. I was part of the Touching Base committee for 20 years and held different roles there, including the referral list database operator, and was the training coordinator when I resigned in 2020 after 20 years of service there. So I did my master's at Sydney University around New South Wales sex workers who provide services for clients with disability, and that's freely available online. I graduated there in 2016, and I've just finished my PhD at Western Sydney University, which was about exploring the experiences of people with disability who access sex work services in Australia, and I'm hoping to graduate in the next few months as Dr. Wotton.
Dr. Wotton, one of the most delightful and intelligent people that I have ever spoken to, breaks down some of the misconceptions and double standards that sex workers are held to when concerning their ability to move around and practice overseas.
Giving people options. So decriminalization gives people options, and people sometimes don't get it when I talk to them until I talk to them about, well, you know, you go to uni and you learn how to become an accountant. And then sometimes you do your apprenticeship as an accountant with like one of the large accountancy firms like Price Waterhouse, which is all around the world. And then you learn from other more experienced senior accountants about all the different accountancy skills. And then you find your specialty. And so some people like to do personal tax. Some people like to do business tax. Some people like to focus on international tax. Some people like superannuation, which is like in America, it's the 401k, retirement funds. So in Australia, it's called superannuation. So you can have self-managed superannuation tax and that set up. And some people like to stay forever working in those large organizations. And then some people go out on their own and they have their own business. And then some people also choose to set up co-ops. So there may be one business center and there will be someone who does personal tax, and then next door there'll be someone who does business tax, and then someone else who do superannuation tax, and then international tax, and they can all refer to each other. Because with decriminalization, it means you can talk openly and you can give referrals as well. So in a lot of the sex worker legislation where it's like legal or part legalization, often it means that you can't refer to other sex workers and you can't be honest about where your boundaries are and what your specialties are. So like in California, you can be a mistress and you can do BDSM, and that's open. But everything else is really hard to negotiate openly, whereas here you can do that. And then to extend the analogy of the accountant, what's really interesting when people get their knickers in the twist of like, you know, the difference between consenting migration with your skill set and with your occupation and trafficking is that once you've done your accountancy training and you become an accountant, then you can actually go to London and you can work in the Price Waterhouse accountancy firm in London. And you know what? There's organizations inside the accountancy firm, but also outside, say for nurses, and they'll say, do you want to work in another country? We'll help you with finding a job, setting up your bank account, places to stay, your airline tickets. We'll set it all up and you can just pay us this one amount and then we'll organize for everything from your trip from Australia to working in England. And I always laugh when I see those ads because I just think that is legal trafficking.
Yeah.
Like in their terms, not in our terms, that is a legal way to migrate with your skill set. So if you recognize sex work as a legally recognized occupation and you have it operating as decriminalization in every place in the world, then sex workers can openly choose to work in different countries without the fear of criminality, standover tactics, blackmail, being deported and locked up, or if something goes wrong and someone is abused or threatened or harmed, then you can go to the police. So with an accountant that goes to England, if they have their bag stolen or if they are sexually assaulted, then they can go to the police. And the same with nurses. But with sex workers, you can't do that. So people lose their minds over the fact that, oh my God, like, you know, these sex workers are, you know, go across state lines. It's like, yeah, we're choosing to do that for many different reasons. So yeah, I always try to find parallels. Sorry, I've gone on a bit of a journey, but
No.
people don't get it because they get into this salacious idea of what sex work is, and that as soon as you pay us money, we'll open our legs and we'll do anything. And what I often say is, even some of my friends were very surprised years ago when I'm like, no, I say no more than I say yes. I spend half my time at work going no, or like, I only offer this and I don't offer this. And today we can do this, and maybe next time we can do this. But it's not just flap some money in our face and you can do whatever you like. There are parameters, and it's also about what our skill sets are. So I always try to bring it back to that in terms of if you compare it and you do similarities with other occupations, you can take the fire out of the discussions when people are talking about the sex industry, so that we can go back to sex workers' work, sex workers' real work. It's different work. You know, some people don't want to be plumbers because you are literally wading in feces, and you couldn't pay me enough money in the world to do that job. But plumbers are highly respected. They're well paid, so they should be. But there's lots of jobs that people don't want to do, but we should be thankful that some people want to do it. So if someone doesn't want to be a sex worker, that's fine. That's your boundary, that's your choice. But you also need to respect those who say, in this part of my life, or now, I'm going to be a sex worker. So everyone should just work really, it's my 4 o'clock alarm. Everyone should work really hard to make sure that we're safe and happy at work.
Let's unpack a couple of different points that Dr. Wotton is making here, and how they relate to the false narratives of sex trafficking. First, I wanted to highlight the excellent example that she makes about other vanilla industries in the world. Most people will relocate for their work at least once in their lives. Hell, in America, it is common for college students to move halfway across the country for their degrees. The only difference between people who are accountants or nurses who relocate with a company and a sex worker who chooses to move countries to continue their career is that sex workers are engaging in, shockingly, sexual acts. The way I often find myself explaining the bizarre double standards here is, imagine that you, a fully fledged human being, wanted to go on a backpacking trip around Europe with the intent of meeting some sexy European people and having sex with them. Or maybe you just happened to travel and you met somebody and you slept with them. Now consider that migrant sex workers are just doing the same thing. Sex workers are just people who are traveling to have consensual sex with other adults. The only difference is that they're getting money for it. Now, I know that I have had some weird hookups in the past that I wish I had at least been paid for, if not just to pay the therapy bills. And I'm sure that a majority of listeners have had the same thought at least once. So what exactly is the big hang-up on migrant sex workers? Why do we criminalize and demonize people who are just working their job, the way that the rest of us vanilla population are as well? Most anti-trafficking legislation, including in Aotearoa, smacks of infantilization and, in complete honesty, racism. Why would somebody coming in from another country be less equipped to choose their profession and what they do with their body than anyone else? Why are migrant sex workers suddenly all victims? Alex Andrews speaks on this lack of understanding and double standards while we discuss the common misconceptions of the industry.
Yeah.
There's so many that all of us want to leave and that all of us want to stay. You know what I mean? There's two huge ends of the spectrum. There's people who are super happy doing this and they wouldn't want to do anything else, like me. And then there are people who shouldn't be doing it, but have no other choice and no other opportunity.
And where do you think, like, how do those misconceptions like inform, I guess, the advocacy work that you're doing? Or like, how do you think that relates to what you said earlier about the biggest problem being each other And
Well, because we have to communicate with each other. We have to maintain these open lines of communication, because if we don't, we're going to we're going to continue this existence of being marginalized and vulnerable. We have to have our voices. We have to be able to communicate with each other, and then we have to better communicate our intent to our audience.
Generalizations like this are the foundation for so many issues that sex workers face in being recognized and getting rights. Dr. Wotton and Alex discussed another one of the key stigmatizations that are barriers towards safe and happy practices. Sex workers are so often infantilized as people who have no control over their bodies and are constantly being manipulated. However, sex work is all about agency. As we have heard from people like Katie and Annie in the previous episode, sex work is often an outlet for regaining control in life and creating pathways through independency and self-reliance. Dr. Wotton also dispelled the notorious rumor that sex workers are somehow open to everything, when in reality, much of sex work is about setting and maintaining boundaries with clients, and, as Dr. Wotton says, saying no to things. Personally, I have found that when I've reached out to sex worker communities online for advice, every single person there immediately reassured me that saying no was the simplest option. I've literally had 12 people message me independently to hype me up and encourage me that if I was dithering on a request, that was my sign that I just didn't want to. The power of no is a beautifully understood thing in the sex work community. Again, sex workers aren't fragile people who are constantly being taken advantage of. Inflated numbers and statistics around sex trafficking, an inherently non-consensual thing, is what helps to bolster the idea that sex workers need rescuing and not rights. Returning to the idea of sex trafficking cases that are being reported in the United States, I wanted to dive into some of the other factors that have caused these numbers to inflate and cause panic amongst hopeful med students in an airport in Miami. A huge part of the problem with sex trafficking statistics is that the laws in the United States around what constitutes sex trafficking are incredibly broad and confusing. I spent several hours trawling my way through federal legislation on sex work and sex trafficking, as well as an in-depth look into the laws in my home state of Rhode Island. Immediately, there are several clear issues with the wording of the legislation. This is a segment from the United States Department of State, which defines sex trafficking as, quote, "Sex trafficking encompasses the range of activities involved when the trafficker uses force, fraud, or coercion to compel another person to engage in a commercial sex act or causes a child to engage in a commercial sex act." The crime of sex trafficking is also understood through the acts, means, and purpose framework. All three elements are required to establish a sex trafficking crime, except in the case of a child sex trafficking, where the means are irrelevant. The acts element of sex trafficking is met when a trafficker recruits, harbors, transports, provides, obtains, patronizes, or solicits another person to engage in commercial sex. The means element of sex trafficking occurs when a trafficker uses force, fraud, or coercion. Coercion in the case of sex trafficking includes a broad array of means included in the forced labor definition. These can include threats of serious harm, psychological harm, reputational harm, threats to others, and debt manipulation. The purpose element is a commercial sex act. Sex trafficking can take place in private homes, massage parlors, hotels, or brothels, among other locations, as well as on the internet. End quote. On the surface, this might appear to be a standard set of definitions. However, these terms are frequently misused in practice. Consider the definition of a trafficker: someone who has been harboring, transporting, patronizing, or soliciting another person for sex work. This now indicts anyone who has transported a sex worker from one location to another. Consider a husband driving his wife to the office that she operates out of. He is now legally classified as a sex trafficker. A brothel madam who owns a home that sex workers work from. She is now classified as a sex trafficker. A mother who lives with her child who is a sex worker who works out of the basement. The house is in the mother's name, and so now she is a sex trafficker because she is harboring a sex worker. Even in some cases, a child who lives in their house with their mother,
who eats food bought by their mother and wears the clothes bought by their mother can be indicted because they have been profiting off of sex work, aka sex trafficking. Somebody who patronizes a sex worker, aka somebody who buys sex from a sex worker, is considered a trafficker. And most concerningly, if one sex worker wants to work with somebody else and they agree to split the profits, that is soliciting. Now both sex workers can be charged with trafficking the other. This might seem like a stretch, but it simply isn't. The fear of felony charges being levied at sex workers is so great that most sex workers don't work with or communicate with other sex workers openly anymore. One of the most recent additions to these laws, FOSTA, which stands for the Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, broadened the horizons of these anti-trafficking legislations even further. FOSTA now considers posting ads online, owning an ad company or web platform to be akin to sex trafficking. As a result, several sites used by sex workers to share information and post ads and screen clients were shut down, leaving many sex workers without a safe way to work. COYOTE, Rhode Island, in the wake of this law, decided to launch a survey to see what the actual impact would be on the quote-unquote vulnerable population that was supposed to be protected by the act. Bella Robinson discusses.
Your data's 4 years old. So we had 6 weeks to launch a new survey, collect the data, and then Tara wrote the report. That was used in the amicus brief. And the amicus brief puts it, now the amicus brief, you can't put an argument, you can only give them information. But this is how stupid, Melissa was one of the lawyers that wrote the article. I already know this, and I've been in 8th grade education. Holt versus United States 1913 Supreme Court law says the federal government cannot regulate prostitution. It's left up to the states, but the Mann Act across the state line counts. So FOSTA said if you had 5 prostitution ads, you could go to, all the shit was going to happen, right? And all the websites shuttered. Now, first of all, there's no legal definition of what a prostitution ad is. Escort ads are legal on their face. And second of all, is that not the government trying to regulate prostitution? But they didn't bring any of it up. They didn't bring any of it up. And they also used a guy in Oregon that was a massage therapist that complained that Craigslist shuttered, and now bitch, you can put an ad in the fucking paper like all the other massage therapists. They should have used as a cam worker because they had to have people that hadn't been arrested yet. So Alex from SWAT Behind Bars was one of them, and she was like, she's scared to do outreach because that could be considered facilitating. You give someone a condom, right? And Government Accountability did a report that what happened is all the websites shuttered and they went overseas, and they don't have to comply to subpoenas, and they can no longer effectively investigate trafficking. And they all said the back page was their best tool. And they even gave Carl an award for the FBI.
The study that Bella is referring to here is 4 years of FOSTA, which was eventually published into a book. The study was based off a survey that was handed out to 227 sex workers. One of the first things that the survey found was that FOSTA had actually increased the number of sex trafficking reported by sex workers. There was a 40% reported increase in threat or coercion towards sex workers once they were forced to move their services offline. Dangerous working conditions also increased. From the survey, it was found that there was a 39% increase in unsafe working conditions, including situations where clients would stealth or secretly remove a condom. 54% of people reported an increase in pressure to perform acts outside of their comfort zone. 35% of people had to lower their prices, and 41% of participants began offering services that they were not comfortable with. There was no longer any access to blacklists. This is the form of screening that Annie in Canada and I discussed using, along with her method of screening clients safely.
Yeah, personally, I mean, when I started, it was all just intuition. They just texted me, told me their fake name, and I was like, seems nice enough. And then I had one bad experience and I changed my screening, but it's still not that strict. I don't require a deposit because I don't like people going back into my bank account, and I don't trust all the stuff going on with that, as well as I'm on disability. So I have to be careful like what shows up in my accounts and stuff. But I do ask for a face photo. So if they won't give me a face photo, I won't book with them. And I've had clients who, before I started the face photo rule, became my clients, and they're wonderful guys. And they even say to me, if you had had the face photo thing when I reached out, I wouldn't probably have come. And I'm like, I know, But I feel so much safer when I ask for the face photo. And to me, I even say it on the website, the face photo won't be shown to anyone unless you harass me, attack me, or do anything to harm me. And that would be to stop you from doing it to someone else. So, you know, and I say on my website, you have to trust me and I have to trust you. You know?
Yeah.
So, and the guys that are willing to give the face photo and then show up and I look through the door peephole or I watch them walk from my window into my building and I make sure they're the same guy in the picture. And that made me feel safer because when the guy that was harassing me was sending messages, I knew what he looked like, but I didn't have a picture of him. And I thought, if I make every single person send me a picture and then I make sure they look like the picture when they arrive, I will be able to weed out the people I don't want to see again. Because sometimes they'll just change their phone number and pretend to be someone else, you know? So it just made it easier for me to make sure that I would not take back someone I didn't want. And also, I think when they send you a face photo, it makes them less likely to plan to harm you. That's my opinion. And someone who doesn't want to send a face photo, it doesn't mean that they're a predator, but it could mean that they're a predator.
FOSTA and the other anti-trafficking laws prevent the safety and security that the sex work community thrives on. From the book, 4 Years of FOSTA, I'm going to share some of the responses from sex workers that were written on the survey. Quote, exiting sex work has become significantly less viable because I'm never in a position to save money after the income drop. End quote. Quote, my friends with tentative document status are affected. They really try to stay under the radar. End quote. Quote, FOSTA made security screening impossible and illegal. It's terrifying how lawmakers don't care about our safety, even though the effects of FOSTA were clearly predicted by those inside the industry. End quote. Quote, all you did was prevent women like me, who have made the choice willingly, from making an income. Of those that are truly trafficked, all you did was push it further underground, and you can't help them if you can't see them. This was the most stupid, inconsiderate law of those that are truly trafficked. I've been a working girl since 1987, and not once have I encountered someone that has been trafficked. End quote. Quote, as somebody who was trafficked, it's incredibly insensitive that lawmakers push this kind of thing under the guise of lowering trafficking. All it did was remove a degree of separation from safety that we use and push more providers into the arms of traffickers and pimps. The hypocrisy is unreal. They don't care about us, it's just about control. And I could tell you many stories about the Republicans that have come to me for my services but still support FOSTA. End quote. Quote, before FOSTA, there was a whole network of experienced workers who could help newbies learn things like screening, deposits, blacklists, etc. You took all that away, and now people are more vulnerable to predators. End quote. Quote, before FOSTA, I manually worked at a massage parlor and felt so much safer working with others and knowing that there was always at least 1 to 2 other people looking out for me. It became decidedly more dangerous to work with others, particularly in the same physical space after FOSTA, so I've only worked solo since then and ultimately had to quickly transition to full service / escorting full time. End quote. For some, the result of jail time for sex trafficking under these broad laws is all too real. Alex Andrews' agency, SWAP, runs a pen pal system that connects people with incarcerated members of the sex work community. As part of a program with Brown University, Bella donated an archive of her own personal correspondence with dozens, if not hundreds, of incarcerated individuals. I read through these letters as part of a project I was doing into incarcerated sex workers who are also mothers several years ago, and a few of the entries made a deep impression on me. One of them was from a woman who was referred to as AB, a mother of 2 who was incarcerated in Alaska. In her own words, here are her experiences. Quote, thank God I got 5 and not 10 to 15 years. Heaven forbid working for safety and screening clients snowballs into something that they can spin into human trafficking. Oh wait, they did. Yeah, I was listening to the radio last week, and they were discussing human trafficking, sex trafficking, and labor. I wrote to Redacted about it and blogged about it. I love how they're using big, encompassing words like, quote, public outreach without any action to back it up. I get frustrated just writing about it. End quote. In another letter, she wrote, quote, it is very sad that the state has taken it upon themselves to nail us and take us from our kids. Child molesters and people that run over pedestrians while drunk driving have been getting far less time. It makes no sense. It is just so frustrating. End quote. In another letter, she writes, quote, it's interesting how sex sites are being put into question now. I think it's the tip of the iceberg. Backpage, rent boys. I wonder where all of this moralistic legality is stemming from. I know that now is not forever, and someday this will all be behind me. I am planning on using this time wisely, brushing up on my writing skills, reading books that can enlighten me, gaining strength and courage from the introspective of it all. I refuse to be broken by this. End quote. I don't know where AB is now, but I sincerely hope that she was granted release. Being imprisoned for trying to maintain the safety of her fellow sex workers is one of the most concerning and upsetting stories to come out of these archives. However, it is not the only one. Another series of correspondence, this time from CC, recorded a harrowing story about being incarcerated on human trafficking charges. Quote, well, my mom been telling me that a lot of people will be writing to me, even people out of state. I didn't even know that my case is going around the world. I don't even know what they put up. Are you allowed to send me an article about it? Well, I'm going to the law library next week to do some research on human trafficking and about my charges/case. End quote. While there were no details about why CC had been incarcerated, it is clear from this letter that even CC was confused about why she'd been incarcerated. It seems logical to put together that if somebody doesn't even know what human trafficking is, most likely whatever happened was not done with any malicious intent. People who are seriously and legitimately trafficking and abusing people are people who know exactly what they're doing and why it's wrong. Cece clearly didn't even know why she was arrested. Finally, these prison letter archives led me to AM. AM wrote to Bella in 2018, quote, Dear Bella, thank you for sharing your story with me. It meant a lot to me and it sounds like my story in a way. I've pretty much been on the street since I've been 12, selling my body. I got pregnant at an early age, went from house to house, and I remember once I was 13, staying with a 35-year-old man because it was cold out and it was the only place I had to stay at all. I had to pay because, of course, I had no money, so all I had was sex. That's when I started tricking. I used to go and see this one old man when I was like 15, and I'd let him do things to me. In return, I'd bring home food for my little sister and brother and beer for my dad so that he would be in a good mood and not beat on us. My mom had took off that time for a couple of months and left us with my dad. All he did was drink, sleep, and hit us. End quote. If you wanted an actual example of what child sex trafficking looks like, this is it. AM was 12 when she started being abused, and was consistently taken advantage of by older men for years. And yet, it's AM who is incarcerated. These laws that are supposed to help to stop sex trafficking are just as likely to target people who would have needed their help the most. The U.S. anti-prostitution and anti-trafficking laws are routinely enforced through raids on known sex worker location and prostitution stings. Anti-trafficking raids on establishments like brothels, massage parlors, and on sex workers' homes are used frequently and are one of the most common ways for law enforcement to locate and rescue sex trafficking victims. Yet despite the claims of rescuing, many of the raids are used to arrest consenting sex workers and unfortunately arrest actual sex trafficking victims without registering them as the very people that they were supposed to serve. Raids can be incredibly violent, scary, and violating for people who are already victims. Police officers are often sent in without training or knowledge of how to interact with trafficking victims, only of sex workers whom they are trained to treat as criminals. Sex workers and victims alike face rough treatment from police, including physical assault, and are often escorted out of the premises in their work clothes, which can be revealing lingerie or robes. Victims are often scared of deportation or having their names and faces leaked to the press. Many people don't tell their families that they are involved in sex work because of the stigma, and for sex trafficking victims, this can be especially traumatizing. There are reports of workers being threatened with their information being leaked to the press if they do not cooperate and name names. Some of these reports have been documented in the paper The Use of Raids to Fight Trafficking in Person by Melissa Ditmore. Interactions with the police can be so negative that self-identified trafficking victims do not feel safe nor respected enough to disclose their situation to police officers. This can result in victims being arrested as sex workers and going through difficult court proceedings and even more negative experiences at police stations. Melissa Ditmore, in her report, The Use of Raids to Fight Trafficking in Persons, reported on how sex trafficking victims are arrested multiple times without being identified or screened as sex trafficking victims, despite being picked up in an anti-trafficking raid. In her report, she wrote, quote, "Overall, participants reported that raids were chaotic and often traumatic events, which left them frightened and confused, and with no sense of what was happening or would happen to them. They made it quite clear that they did not understand who was conducting the raid, other than government agents, or what its purpose was, other than to arrest and deport them, or what the outcome might be. The women interviewed expressed a variety of opinions on the use of raids as anti-trafficking tools, and the role played by the raid in obtaining their freedom. Participants who did not identify as trafficked uniformly objected to the raids. Many who were identified as trafficked resented their experiences during the raids. Jin, who was arrested in a local police raid, expressed anger at having been pistol whipped, and said that she would have eventually left on her own because she expected to be released by her trafficker within days of the raid in which she was arrested. Josefina, who was coerced into prostitution and was identified as trafficked as a result of a federal anti-trafficking raid, said that she would have left on her own if she had known of a safe place to go. Although Ophelia knew of no other way to escape her situation, she nevertheless described the raid and her subsequent detention as, quote, terrible. Another woman said that she would have preferred to leave her situation by leaving with a co-worker rather than being rounded up in a raid. Additionally, 6 of the women interviewed for this report, who identified as being trafficked, left trafficking situations after and independent of their involvement with law enforcement. They reported receiving help from a variety of people, including clients and co-workers at the sex work venues, who recognized that they were in coercive situations and stepped in to offer help. These 6 women who left on their own after their involvement with the law enforcement subsequently approached law enforcement on their own behalf and cooperated in the prosecution of their traffickers." End quote. On the last episode, we heard Alex speak about being targeted by the police in a raid while at her job in a strip club. Bella was also no stranger to the terrifying process.
So when I was in Jersey, when I fled Florida, I sent you that link about my kind of life up until then. And a violent the SWAT team came in my door with Ram because me and my girlfriend, who were 44 at the time, had a Craigslist ad. Yeah, and it was really violent. They came in with I had a big glass door. They could have just broke the door and opened it, but they used the Ram. It was Thursday in the rain, and the little midget cops running around, and they had guns, like we were terrorists or something. Shit.
Even if sex trafficking was as prolific as the media accuses it of being, no one can claim that these violent and dehumanizing raids are the correct way to treat somebody who has been the victim of a crime. In her paper, Ditmore pointed out that trafficking victims are more likely to look to other sex workers or their clients for help if they're in trouble. I can attest to an example of this firsthand. Last month, I was on a subreddit for sex workers when a post came along asking if they were being trafficked. The user wasn't sure what was going on, didn't know who to talk to, and was scared to go to the police in case they admitted to being part of a crime. Within an hour, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of people in the comments telling the user what to do, who to go to, and offering support and physical in-person assistance. Many people warned the user not to go straight to the police, but to instead go to a women's shelter and find help from sexual harm reduction agencies. The comments were filled with negative experiences of going to the police with similar situations. Not a single person judged or pitied. They simply launched into action.
And so in that vein, like, being able to work together is what really promotes the safety. Is that what you're...
Absolutely. You know, it promotes everybody's health and safety. They are able to share information without each other. I had girls who were sexually assaulted, not by a client, but by their intimate partner when I owned an escort service before. And they could come to me and tell me, hey, listen, this happened. Hey, listen, this happened. You know, and we could talk about it. We could talk it through. I could put them in a different position. I could have them, be a hostess instead of whatever. I could have them answer the phone. There's all kinds of things I could have them do, as opposed to running calls while they spent time recovering. And at the same time, they had a safe place to do it.
To echo the words of Alex at the beginning of this podcast, people, including law enforcement and legislators, need to learn to listen. I find Alex to be of a unique position to talk about sex trafficking legislation, especially because she was almost placed on the sex offender list for her participation in the sex industry.
Yeah.
I got arrested in 1993 for aggravated promotion of prostitution because I owned a large escort service.
Mm-hmm.
They crucified me. They absolutely crucified me. I was, I had hired a lawyer. I went through the whole thing. We went through 3 years of court stuff, and I finally ended up with a 10-year sex offender probation. But I had already moved to Florida, and when I moved to Florida, Florida did not accept their probation requirements. And so I was not considered a sex offender here. I did not have to register as a sex offender here. Thank God.
Yeah.
Because that would have just ended my life.
At the beginning of this episode, I brought up a letter that Polaris had written in opposition to a decriminalization bill for Washington, D.C. I'm going to read a snippet of that now. Quote, "This bill goes way further than specifically decriminalizing people in prostitution. This bill also repeals multiple different crimes related to overall sex trade in Washington, D.C., including pimping/pandering, brothel keeping, and sex buying." End quote. This harkens back to that old argument that buyers of sex are somehow all monstrous people. It's the same premise that founded the legislation of the Swedish model, explained here again and expanded on by Dr. Wotton.
So I always talk about, it's like saying, oh yeah, we support you baking bread. Of course you can bake bread, but you can't rent a bakery. You can't advertise and put signs up that there's bread there. And anyone who buys bread from you is illegal, and we will criminalize them and threaten to out them to their families, which is what Sweden did, and then jail you. And then you can't advertise anywhere in this country that you're doing bread, that you're baking bread. But yeah, of course, you poor little baker, of course you can bake the bread. We're not stopping you, but we're going to sit outside your bakery and we're going to charge everyone who comes in to buy the bread. And when I say that to people are like, really? Oh, is that what it is? I just thought like we were like saving people from those nasty clients. And I'm like, no, clients are good. Client pays my mortgage.
Yeah.
Clients are great. Predators are criminals. We need to separate this. It's not clients who are raping sex workers.
Mm-hmm.
We need to be very clear that clients are, it's a mutually consenting adult activity, and both parties are adults. And the people who are doing any violent behaviour, standover tactics, blackmail to sex workers are predators and criminals. You'll notice in countries and debates about, we should have the Swedish model, that it's very much focused on criminalising those men who pay those women for sexual services. I mean, really dismissing the fact that sex workers are able to consent. So the framing of it as a young female victim, I mean, literally abolitionists have said that there's no such thing as being able to consent. that it's all rape and sexual assault, which is real infantilization of women for a start, but also there's people of all genders who are part of the sex industry, and our clients are not just male as well, they're all genders. So, trans workers, non-binary workers, intersex workers and clients, female clients, and sex workers across the board, and it needs to be non-gendered if you're looking at anything to do with the sex industry, because safety for one is safety for all. But as soon as you go down that path of those men are raping those women, then, the argument should have just been gone. I'm sorry, you're beating your own drum over here, but it's got nothing to do with keeping the people within the industry safe. So I think that's a real problem. Massive problem. And also, like I said earlier, people are very fixated on the fact that if you flap money around in front of a sex worker's face, then we just are like their puppets, like that they purchase us. You hear a lot about people selling their bodies, and on one hand it's a very serious comment, and the other half we're just always rolling our eyes and laughing, because it's well, as far as I'm concerned, when I look down, my body is still with me. I've been a sex worker for over 30 years. I can't sell my body. My body's mine. I sell sexual services for a pre-negotiated amount of time on a certain day for a certain price, and it's very specific services. So it's not that you pay me money and you can do whatever you want to me. That's not how this works. Once again, I can't go to an accountant and say, you need to do all of my accountancy, you need to do my BAS statement, you need to do my personal tax, you need to do my business tax, you need to do all of this, because they'll be like, I only offer personal tax, I don't do all this other tax. You can't go to a GP and say, do cardiac surgery on me. You have to go to a specialist. You break a leg, you can't go to, you go to A&E, accident and emergency at the hospital. They don't do surgery and put pins in you there. They send you to a specialist who is going to do that surgery. And you have to be assessed, and it has to be pre-negotiated. It's the same with the sex industry. So people lose their minds over this.
Misinformation about sex trafficking is fueled by misinformation about the sex industry. Unfortunately, as much as I hate to admit it, the two have become conflated over time, even though they should not be. Some of this misinformation stems from the idea that sex workers don't have any agency over themselves or their bodies. It comes from infantilizing and racist notions of what it means to be a sex worker and what it means to travel and enjoy your job and, shockingly, enjoy having sex, enjoy helping other people to have sex, or just enjoy certain sexual activities. Dr. Wotton has brought up so many incredibly eloquent points during our conversation, and one of them that really stuck out to me was how much she reinforced her own agency that she has over her body, because she is in fact a fully fledged human being that doesn't need other people to tell her what she can and cannot do, and is also somebody who knows her own limits, her own likes, her own dislikes, and what she wants to do with her body and with her life. If we stopped trying to control other people and sat back for a second, we might notice that you don't have a problem with what somebody else is doing, but you may have a problem with how you are conducting your own life, how you view your own self. Instead of questioning why somebody is doing something, stop for a second and question why you have a problem with what somebody else is doing in the privacy of their own home and in the privacy of their own bodies. The misinformation and myths around sex work are old. They are old, and they are rooted in just about every culture that you might find. They are rooted in sexism. They are rooted in racism. They are rooted in homophobia. They are rooted in the idea that we cannot allow other people to have control over themselves. They are rooted in the idea that women don't deserve to have agency over their bodies. They are rooted in the idea that Black and brown people shouldn't have the right to have agency over what they do with their bodies. In the bizarrely religious fanaticism idea that sex is something that is dirty, not something that is natural and that should be celebrated. It is rooted in these ideas that gay people or trans people or anybody who is part of the queer community shouldn't be allowed to like what they like. They shouldn't be allowed to do whatever they like because of some bizarre moral hierarchy that doesn't make sense in the first place and just simply doesn't concern you. Let people live. Let people exist as they are and enjoy doing things that they enjoy doing. Let people go and buy those things that they enjoy doing. Let people have access to a healing space, a safe space, an orgasmic space. Why are you so focused on what somebody else is doing in their bedroom, in their office, in their own home? If you ask me, it's giving more perverted behavior than what any of these sex workers are doing behind closed doors. Get your ear off the door. Stop listening to what other people are doing, and stop trying to control what other people are doing. Allow people to have agency over themselves. It's going to free up so much time for you in your personal life to maybe focus on some of the issues that you might be projecting onto other people. You don't have to like what everybody else is doing, but you do have a duty to respect it, to respect people's autonomy and respect their lives for how they have chosen to live them. So, what do we know about sex trafficking? What do we know about protecting people from sex trafficking? First and foremost, we need to understand what it actually is and what it isn't. It isn't sex work. The conflation of these two things is incredibly damaging for both sex workers and sex trafficking victims. I've said it before that the best way for people in power to wield that influence responsibly is by admitting when they have to stop and listen to the real people who are being impacted by what they are doing. Sex workers have said time and time again that decriminalizing the profession is what is key to safety. By listening to the narratives of the sex workers that I've interviewed for this podcast, you can hear how working without fear, accessing resources like healthcare, government assistance, and help if needed, is what makes the industry safe and enjoyable. It is also what makes accessing the industry less shameful, less stigmatized, and more accessible for the millions of people worldwide who find joy in the services that sex workers provide. By listening to the few narratives of sex workers that I've interviewed for this podcast, you can also hear that regardless of legislation, sex work is going to keep happening. We heard from Bella and from Alex that they have experienced horrifying episodes with the US government, but have remained in the industry, or have at least remained as advocates of the industry. Their determination and courage in fighting for decriminalization and their perspectives are incredibly influential and important pieces of evidence for the validity of their cause. Writing this episode has often led me to need to take breaks so that I could calm down enough to continue researching. A lot of the information that is out there is incredibly biased and harmful when released to the general discourse. I will be the first to admit that I can be considered to be incredibly biased as well. However, I have done the best that I can to provide you with real information where possible. You have probably noted that I have declined to give you my estimate on sex trafficking victims because I recognize that the data is often skewed and includes too many non-sex trafficking related offenses, and it is difficult to come by considering the underground nature of the crime. And I've also tried to provide as many voices on this topic as I can. I'm tired and I'm upset that I still have to explain to people that sex trafficking is not something that happens when random strangers grab you off the street. I'm also tired of knowing that nothing I said to those people in the Miami airport was actually taken seriously. The amount of misinformation around the sex industry is so mammoth that it takes a long time for something like this to get through. However, people like Bella, Alex, Katie, Annie, and Dr. Wotton are shining examples of what it means to persevere and support other people. I'm going to end this podcast with some words of wisdom from Alex.
Well, obviously decriminalization of sex work would be a wonderful thing. It wouldn't be great if they decriminalized sex work across the world, everywhere, tomorrow, we still wouldn't see a reduction in stigma and discrimination for another decade. We're going to go through 2 cycles of new workers before we really have an understanding of the vulnerabilities that were caused by criminalization. And then we're still left with problems. We're still left with violence against women. We're still left with rape kits who haven't been tested in forever. We're still not listening to women who say they've been assaulted. We're still not making services and support readily available for someone who does want to exit, but they'd like to not be arrested. You know, there's no safe space. And I'd like to see a lot more safe spaces. I'd also like to see drugs decriminalized. I think that our bodies are our own. And I think that that is yet another representation of coercive control when you tell someone that they can't do drugs when very many times they're doing it to self-medicate.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it, because I think we're also definitely seeing where I'm from, obviously decrim for about 20 years now, and we're still fighting like a lot of
Yeah.
stigmatization, and we
And a
currently
lot of misunderstandings, you know what I mean? A lot of misunderstandings about what it looks like. But at the end of the day, the government of New Zealand and the US Prostitutes Collective got together and said, let's open an office together and we'll work together in order to make this problem go away. And they did it. And they did it.
Yeah.
Violence against workers has greatly decreased in New Zealand because it's just not tolerated, and they can report it.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Illuminated in Red Light. And a big, big thank you to all of my guests who participated on this episode of the show. If you have comments, questions, compliments, concerns that you would like to give me, please feel free to comment down below or message me at Illuminated in Red Light Pod on Instagram. My final thanks is to Professor Austin Jackson, who encouraged me to start this project and without whom I absolutely would never have completed this. Everything here is owed to you. And also to me. Thank you to me. And always remember, rights, not rescue. Hello, me again. Just chiming in with an important note about one of my guests, Dr. Rachel Wotton. Please note that while this recording was done in anticipation of Rachel's June conferral, due to human and system failure, this achievement was formally relayed to the government, and therefore her conferral will now occur on the 20th of August 2025. Rachel's work and her website has been linked into the show notes below,